And good morning, everybody. And as you just heard from the room change, we are going head-to-head with a session on the future of the Republican Party, which I would take a wild guess might end up being a bit depressing. So we're going to offer some optimism. We're going to be the feel-good session, talking about how companies are remaking the landscape in spite of politics, often in reaction to politics, in some really interesting ways. And I say that because I was at the Cannes Advertising Festival last week, the Cannes Line event, which used to be known as a place where mad men went even madder. They sat around on their yachts, they cut deals, they drank a lot, etc., etc. But this year in Cannes, there was an absolutely astonishing development, which is that you could not move for people talking about purpose. Along the beachfront, you had all these posters talking about ESG, you had Sustainable Development Goal events, if you can believe it, and it was absolutely the buzzword, which is remarkable. But. There was also a new buzzword at the festival, which was actually put out by the CEO of Unilever, which is woke washing. You can go and tell your daughters, grandkids, anyone else about the issue of woke washing. And what that basically means is that all these companies, all these mad men, all these advertisers have basically gone around grabbing the idea of purpose, but actually not really doing anything at all. They want to look woke, but they don't actually know what it means unless they've got teenagers in their life, and they don't actually live up to the hype. And if you want an example of just how much uncertainty there is in this sphere, consider this. We at the FT are actually launched a couple of weeks ago a newsletter and platform to look at the whole issue of ESG and corporate purpose, and we found out that the range of estimates about how big the ESG sector is today go from 31 trillion, according to the industry groups, that's how much assets are invested in ESG compliant securities, down to 3 trillion from JP Morgan. 28 trillion difference, who's counting? So we have two fantastic CEOs here this morning to tell us what exactly is happening here, why they are embracing the concept of corporate purpose, how they define it, how they decide what it actually is going to mean in a practical term, how they actually interact with their owners and shareholders and the wider community around this, and also how they avoid or don't avoid the issue of woke washing. Now, I'm sure you all know who they are. We've got Chip Bergh, CEO of Levi's, a man who apparently, it came out during the recent IPO, wears his Levi's in the shower. He's so passionate. And Dan Schulman from PayPal, who again is a man who's well known to all of you. But I'd like to start with you, Chip. What do you mean by corporate purpose?
Well, I'm blessed. I joined this company almost 8 years ago, and Levi Strauss & Company has been around for 166 years, invented the blue jeans 145 years ago. And corporate purpose for us goes all the way back to our founder. I inherited this, and we have a long legacy of being the kind of company that's not afraid to take a stand on important issues of our day. When Levi Strauss, the man himself, the very first year he made a profit, he donated a portion of that profit to a charity locally. And actually that charity is still around. And so it goes all the way back to our founder. And as I said, we've got a century plus legacy of taking a stand on important issues of our day. So we desegregated our factories in the South 10 years before it was the law of the land. It was controversial at the time. If you fast forward in the 1990s, when the Boy Scouts banned gay troop leaders, we pulled all of our funding from the Boy Scouts. We got 130,000 letters and emails over the next week. 97% of them were people saying they were going to never buy a pair of Levi's again. And the company did not waver. And I think one of the things that I use as a filter to decide where and how we take a stand is, will history judge us as being on the right side of the issue when we look back 20 or 30 years? And now you can look back on the desegregation issue, you can look back on the Boy Scout issue, and any number of the issues that we've taken a stand for. And with the benefit of hindsight and a couple of decades between now and then, you can say we were clearly on the right side of the issues. So,
Right.
so for us, we define corporate purpose, our mission. We talk about profits through principles, and our aspiration is to be the kind of company, be the kind of business where it's not just about making a buck and returning dollars to shareholders, but it's also about making a difference in the communities and in the world
Right.
where we operate.
Right.
And we talk about having an outsized impact on the world.
Well, I'm going to come back in a moment and ask you which issues in particular you're looking at, but I want to quickly bring Dan in and ask, would you define corporate purpose any differently?
Not really. I would say too often I think companies think about social responsibility as a separate group inside the company. They think of it as a foundation they've set up or one group that is in charge of social good that the CEO or the company can point to as something that they're doing to help, which is great in and of itself, but I don't really think that that's corporate purpose. I think when you have as your mission as a company, as Chip said, and I fully agree with that, when your products and your services that you put out into the market are part and parcel of what your corporate purpose is and what your social mission is, that's when you have a values-driven or purpose-led company. It is not having values up on a wall. It is taking action against them. It is having the courage to do that. Some of the things that Chip mentioned in Levi's history took courage to go and do. Some of the things that we've done at PayPal, like withdrawing from North Carolina when they passed HB2, which was a bill that we felt allowed for the potential discrimination of somebody for their sexual orientation or sexual identity. We received quite a number of letters as well. I received quite a number of death threats as well. Those take courage to step forward. But I think if that's part of your values as a company, if you don't take action on them, then your values are really just propaganda. They aren't really what you stand for as a company. And I think as you are looking, Jillian, through moral money, and those are, to me, the examples. Like, does somebody take a stand where it may not necessarily be a popular stand, but it is clearly associated with their values, not political, not political. It's associated with your values. And sometimes those can get confused. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I think you make decisions based on values, and based on your mission as a company, and you're doing the right thing.
But when we came out with Moral Money, which is here, I chose the slogan Moral Money to be a bit cynical because I'm in the information game. And it was the only phrase I could find which, once I said it, nobody forgot it. And basically, once it was out, I tossed it out in a meeting, it went viral inside the FT immediately, and everyone said, oh my God, it's not an acronym, thank God. It's not ESG, CSR, SRI, whatever else. But we've had some backlash from people saying, well, how dare you call it moral money? Because how dare you say that anyone has the right to impose their morals than anyone else? Now, as it happens, I'm actually more trying to show that, what investors face today is more risk management, where there's societal pressure to be seen to be moral, never mind whether people in charge of companies actually feel moral. But what do you say to people who say, well, you have your values, you want to act in a moral way, but that's kind of you imposing your morals on everyone else, and that's just not right?
Well, I mean, I do think, look, this is a very, very tricky subject, but I think what Dan said about your actions have to be consistent with your words. For us, for the Levi's brand, we're all about authenticity. And if our actions as a company are internal actions, what we say, what we do, how we act, kind of do we put our money where our mouth is on these issues, has to be consistent with the stands that we've taken. And I really do believe that in today's world, companies have a responsibility to do more than just earn a profit and return cash to shareholders. We have a responsibility to make a difference in the world, particularly as governments are backing away from some of their responsibility. NGOs aren't as engaged in some areas as they have to be. And I think we're blessed to be CEOs running companies, and our voice really does matter. You can't talk about everything, so you have to be choiceful about it. But I really do think we have a responsibility. When Dan took action in North Carolina, it had a ripple effect. And I think that's part of what being a CEO today is all about.
But I mean, just to bring the other example, I just found my quote. Hester Pierce, who is a Republican appointee on the Security Exchange Commission, just last week said, quote, "In our modern corporate ESG world, there's a group of people who take the lead in instigating their fellow citizens into a frenzy of moral rectitude. Once worked up, the crowd takes matters into its own brutish hands." I don't know if you knew that you were part of a brutish crowd. "And finds many ways to extract penalties from the identified wrongdoers." And she goes on to say that ESG standards are, quotes, "nebulous. They're bashing peddlers," and she attacked, quotes, "peddlers of such products as self-appointed and self-righteous."
Is she speaking at the Republican breakout session right now?
No, she was speaking at the AEI. But anyway, so that's the counter view. I mean, Dan, do you feel self-righteous?
Sometimes. No, but I try very hard to look at all of our decisions not as political decisions. Look, our mission as a company at PayPal is to try and democratize financial services, to make sure everyone in the world has access to managing and moving their money, access to the digital economy. That's a fancy way of saying that managing and moving money should be a right for all citizens and not a privilege for the affluent. What does that mean? It means that every citizen should be able to be involved. And that is a very inclusive mission. And therefore, our values, our primary values, are about being inclusive. So when we took the stand in North Carolina, we've taken a lot of stands. We've taken stands after Charlottesville against hate groups. We've stood up for federal workers when they were furloughed. We've done a ton of things, but every time I talk about that, I say that's not a red issue or a blue issue, it's a red, white, and blue issue. Honestly, here in America, it's an American value not to discriminate against people. Like, you should be able to stand up for whatever you believe in. That's fundamental to our core values as a country. And so to me, when somebody says, well, wait, you're taking a political decision, I really push back hard on that. It has to be consistent with our values as a company. And our values as a company, I think, are those that transcend partisan politics. I had a chance to talk in front of a crowd, maybe a little bit larger than this one, that were basically predominantly Navy SEALs, but special ops forces and Gold Star families who had sons or daughters killed in action. And I was talking about North Carolina. I was talking about sexual identity and sexual orientation. And I remember there was a gentleman who was standing over here who had his hands crossed. And I was like, oh, he is not with me on this at all.
You probably thought
you
you
really
were British too.
Make sure that I run away from him because he could probably kill me. And so, but I talked about, this is what America stands for. This is our best values, and we need to take stands. This is what we're supposed to do as companies, as leaders, as concerned citizens. And this is the first time ever that just the crowd just got up and gave a standing ovation. I watched, and this guy got up and was leading it. And so, to me, I think this can be inspiring. This can be something that people rally behind. And I think we have, as CEOs, a responsibility now to do the right thing. We have a responsibility to do that, and I firmly believe it. And as Chip and I both have talked about this lots of times, because sometimes it's lonely doing this, and we've talked about it a lot. But we stand for certain things, and we're not apologetic about it. Our investors know what we stand for, and we don't hide it at all. And we don't believe that actually there's a duality between creating great profits and doing good in the world. In fact, I think those things are linked together.
So who inside your company actually gets to decide what those values should be and what is moral? I mean, is it just you? Is it your board of directors? Do you take a vote amongst the employees? Do you go out and ask the shareholders? I mean, how do you actually go about defining what you're going to care about?
So I'll answer the question, but I just want to pile on real brief. I mean, the easiest thing for us to do is to be silent on everything, right? That's easy. It's to not take a stand. But there are issues in the world today, and as CEOs running purpose-driven companies, the right thing to do is to take a stand on some of these issues. And when you take a stand on a divisive issue, there are going to be people who really do rally behind you, and maybe it's okay to be whipping up a frenzy, to use her words.
A British crowd, yes.
And maybe that's okay to cause more of a debate around some of these big issues in society.
So who decides?
So we have a process. Obviously, this is, when you decide to take a stand on an important or controversial issue, it is a process. We have a framework which I've established with our board of directors on a number of kind of big themes where I have the latitude to decide where and how we weigh in. Human rights is one. So, when the immigration ban happened a week after the president was inaugurated, we jumped in, and with our nonprofit organization, our nonprofit foundation, we announced devoting $1 million or investing $1 million in local organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area to protect marginalized communities at the time of the immigration ban. And literally they were there at the airport as people were getting turned around and not being allowed to enter the United States to help those families. Because it fit within the broad framework of human rights. Human rights, the environment or sustainability is another big one, where and LGBTQ is the third big one. And then recently, within the past year, we added kind of putting an end to the gun epidemic in this country. And that was a process. I mean, there is no debate that we have an epidemic of gun violence in this country, and it is affecting the fabric of this society. And we don't have a dog in the hunt. We don't sell guns. We don't make guns. In fact, if anything, we go back to the wild, wild west as Levi's. But when I was a kid growing up, I worried about nuclear bombs dropping from the Soviet Union. Remember the duck and cover drills where we had to dive underneath the desk? And when I was in second or third grade, I got in trouble because I made one of the boys next to me laugh because we didn't take it seriously. It was a threat, but not really a credible threat. In our lifetime, a nuclear bomb never dropped on New York City. And so, but my daughter, who is 10 years old, knows that when they do their lockdown drills at school, that's a credible threat. Because she watches the news and she knows, she goes to school every day wondering if a lockdown drill is going to be a real drill or a real thing. And her school practices lockdown drills more often than they do earthquake drills.
Wow.
And we live in San Francisco.
How do you decide what you're going to campaign on? Because you've taken some pretty controversial stances, and as you say, it has resulted in death threats towards you. If I was a shareholder, I might be saying, well, is that a sensible use of corporate time to be essentially taking that kind of risk or creating that kind of risk? So who decides in your company what you're going to care about?
Mm-hmm. First thing we did was establish what our mission was and what our purpose as a company was. And we had that opportunity because we spun out of eBay. Chip had that opportunity because he did their IPO. But we got to define what kind of company we wanted to be. And when we had that, naturally from that was a set of values that came out of that.
And we as you, or
Me
one or two
and-
trusted lieutenants?
No,
Or?
me and my whole senior team. And then we syndicated that with our full leadership team. And then we talked to the whole company about it. So these have to be felt by the whole company. And by the way, what I say to the company all the time is the power of what we have is, 30,000 voices around the world that can express themselves. They don't necessarily have to believe in every single stand that we take, and they won't. But they need to understand that it's consistent with the values of the company. And but once we had that, we talked about those values with the board. We talked about what we were trying to go do. But you can't go back to your board, at least well, maybe you should, but I don't feel like I need to go back to the board on all the decisions we had. When North Carolina passed, I was watching the governor of North Carolina basically say, companies are doing a lot of things right now, but they're signing petitions, but they're not really taking any action. And I literally walked down the hallway to this guy right here, who was our head of our corporate comm Franz, and said, in a week, we are out of North Carolina. In a week. And so
Did you get any
ready.
pushback inside the company?
Nope, no pushback whatsoever. In fact, it was
shareholders?
really, nope, not at all. It was a defining moment inside the company where it was one of our first moments where people said, you know what, we are a values-led company. We do stand up for our values. And it's not easy. It isn't easy. But we're a giant consumer brand, a giant consumer-focused company. So is Chip with Levi's. We cannot avoid the cultural wars. We can't avoid them. They're around us. And so in our acceptable user policy, which basically says when a website can use PayPal to raise funds, whatever, we say you can't use PayPal to advocate hatred or violence. So you can't raise funds. So if somebody is raising funds and they're advocating violence, we shut down that site from using PayPal. Not shut down the site, but from using PayPal. Violence is easy. You can sort of understand when somebody says they want to kill somebody or whatever. That's like, you get it. Although things are done in code, so you need to understand codes a lot to understand that. Hatred is a much more nuanced type of thing because the only thing that people have ever really said is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. But that's not incredibly helpful, honestly, to tell you the truth, when you're trying to define to somebody spreading hate or not. Whether a Nazi group, we clearly find them as spreading hate. The KKK, spreading hate. And then we have a defined group of people inside PayPal that look at every single website. We have automated scans, and then people can bring websites to us, and we have a legal team, a brand reputation team, a regulatory team. They all come together and look at every website. We go through every link in that website, because that website might, on its surface, seem okay, but link to hatred or violence groups. We go through every video in that to make the difficult decisions as to whether we pull PayPal off or not. And that, to me, is our responsibility to go and do. We are a heavily regulated company because we're a financial services company. We have hundreds of regulators around the world. But just because we're regulated heavily doesn't mean that we don't every single day need to make decisions as to, are we living to our values as a company, and what actions are we taking? Wow,
well, that's certainly, going through websites like that way is certainly not something that's a regular part of an MBA program, to put it mildly.
No.
I'm curious though, what are you going to do about the very live, very hot topic of abortion? Have you taken a stance yet in public on this? Now's your chance.
So I think that a woman's right to choose is an incredibly important issue across our entire country. And I personally am a fervent supporter of that. And I think that every company is going to need to start to think clearly about what is their position around that. And I think from my perspective, every company can't stand for every single issue that's out there. But we've got to understand, like, what are the ones that are crucial for us to stand for, and what are the ones that, I believe in educational rights, but it isn't a thing necessarily that PayPal comes out and supports, even though personally I do. And so it will be a process inside our company to figure out each of these issues. Where do we make stands, and how do we make stands, Julian? Because there are a lot of things where we're very public, and there are a lot of things that we do that you never see,
Right.
but is behind the scenes, where we talk to governors, we talk to a number of politicians.
So just to
around it.
clarify, you haven't yet decided, and you're not yet pulling out of states which take a hardline stance on clamping down on abortion rights. Is that correct?
Yes.
What about you, Chip?
So
I'm sure
actually,
this is a question you don't really want, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, we prepped for it last night. So
Okay, so tell us your prep, and we can give you marks out of 10 as to how fluent it sounds.
well,
and
actually,
how many times you say
No, it is a process. I mean, I think Dan nailed it. It is. I know where I stand on this personally. I believe a woman has the right to choose what happens with her body. Probably even more reinforced since I have a daughter. But and I also happen to believe that this falls under the big umbrella of human rights. But it is, if you think gun violence epidemic and taking a stand on guns is contentious, and I've also gotten the death threats on that one and had unmarked police in front of my house for a couple of weeks.
And I'm sorry for both of you. I don't take this lightly. I mean,
Yeah,
this is real.
So, but if you think that's,
Yeah.
if that's a divisive issue in this country, abortion even more so. So it is something, and let's face it, we're also CEOs running companies. We do have to think about the business impact, and we have to take into consideration all stakeholders. And it is a process. And as I said, just with the gun violence stand that we took, I will be engaging our board of directors on this.
Right.
And it is something that we have to do very, very thoughtfully, and also think through the when and the how, and the what. We tend to not just open our mouth. It has to be authentic, and we have to be willing to, if we're going to take a stand on something, just as we did on immigration, just as we have on gun violence epidemic, we put our money where our mouth is. And so it is going to be a process, and it's certainly coming down the path to turn into a big debate.
As you look to the year ahead, I mean, obviously abortion is a fantastically difficult issue politically. Immigration was difficult, but maybe not so difficult because it cut so immediately into the question of American identity. What other issues, when you look at the year ahead, are going to keep you awake at night in this way in terms of defining what is or is not the right position to take with values? Because, climate's almost easy. Guns are almost easy for many people. But
for me, probably the single biggest thing we are trying to mobilize right now is getting out the vote.
Getting out the vote.
I mean, we live in a democracy, and democracy only works if people vote. And the voter turnout in 2015 for the 2016 presidential election was pathetic in this country. And less than half of the people who were eligible to vote actually voted. So I say you don't have a right to complain about government. You don't have a right to complain about the president or anybody sitting in an elected office if you didn't go to the polls yourself and vote.
Right.
And the demographic that is most impacted is 18 to 35-year-olds. They're the ones who show up the least. So at the midterm elections, we ran a campaign. We had vote T-shirts. We registered voters in our stores around the country. We gave all of our employees a half a day off so that they could go vote. We're one of the few democracies in the world where elections happen on a work day. And we work in San Francisco, and I've got my assistant commutes 90 minutes each way to work.
Right.
So we gave people time off to vote. We actually rallied other companies to join us in this, and registered over 400, which Dan did and PayPal did.
Yeah.
And so we're really focused on engaging our employees and the communities where we live and work to get engaged and involved in the political process in this country.
So Dan, and that's a fascinating issue, by the way, because most people don't think that getting out the vote is normally part of ESG, but that's an interesting way to define it.
It's not red or blue either. It is go vote your conscience, go vote for what you believe in, but let's be a democracy that works by getting everybody who's eligible to vote to go to the polls and vote.
So Dan, when you look ahead to the rest of the year, what's the hot button or the most difficult ESG question you're going to grapple with, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, my favorite quote, and some of you have heard me say this about democracy, is that democracy needs to be more than two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. So think about it. Which means basically that for democracy to thrive, we need to rise above our own self-interests. There needs to be real diplomacy, real coming across the aisle, not thinking about things in absolute terms, black or white, but much more nuanced. And I think that's where our democracy works at its finest. And we can point to legislative efforts that have been far-reaching as a result of that. But we live in a country right now where 2/3 of our population, after like an 8-year incredible economic expansion, struggle to make ends meet at the end of the month. Something like 26% of the country worries about money constantly, every day, every moment, about what's going to happen. It's really the first time families are thinking that their kids aren't going to do better than they're going to do. And so for us, one of the driving issues for us, and a place where we can actually make a difference, and I think this is a really important part that companies need to have their mission be a part of what they can do, is drive financial health in some way. And I'll give you one example of that, Julian. Most people don't know this, but we're probably one of the top 5, maybe one of the top 3 lenders of working capital to small businesses in the country today. We've done over $10 billion of loans. Interestingly, we don't imitate what other people have done. We don't use FICO scores. We use our own algorithms around that. And 25% of our loans, 25%, have gone to the 3% of counties where 10 or more banks have closed branches. Where do banks close branches? Where neighborhoods have a lower median income than the national average. And so we loan disproportionately to women-owned businesses, to minority-owned businesses. And here's the great fact. Where we lend money, on average, of small businesses, sales go up 22% versus a control group of 1% to 2%. So it makes a huge difference in those communities. It makes a difference to those business owners. They might be able to hire 1 or 2 more people. And if we can start to create a foundation in some way, shape, or form of financial health,
right,
I think that is an incredibly important element to a well-functioning democracy, and that is where our company is focused.
right. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a moment, but before I do, Chip, some people might say that, you as a company clearly have a lot of values. You are, in many ways, ESG friendly, environmental, social, and governance. And yet that G part is complicated by the fact, this is a question you didn't want.
Another.
I prepped for this one too.
Exactly, okay.
Whatever it is, he's prepped for.
Okay, so the next one he's prepped for. He knows what I'm going to ask him. You can test how many O's there are next time round now. You have a dual class structure, share structure, which some people would say is not very democratic, not very ESG compliant. What do you say to that?
So we just went public 3 months ago, and very successful IPO. Our S1, which is the document you file with the SEC, we said we were going to go out at $14 to $16 a share. We priced at $17 a share on the day that we launched. It took over an hour and a half for the stock to open, and it opened at $22.22, and it's kind of stayed in that range for the last 3 months or so. But very successful. And in the process of going public, you do a roadshow where you meet with prospective investors. And we did meet with a number of big funds that also have ESG funds. And there was a lot of interest from the ESG funds because of our stands on sustainability and all of the social stands that we've taken and the long track record that we have here. And a lot of people used to say to me, yeah, it's easy for you to do that as a CEO because you're private. You don't have to worry about Wall Street. You don't have to worry about investors. And so we made it a point as we were doing our roadshow to say, this is part of who we are. We're not afraid to take a stand. We are a company that is about profits through principles, and here's our track record, and here are the stands that we've taken. And if you don't like that, that's okay. I respect it. Don't buy our stock. And we did go out dual class, which is different than a lot of the high-tech dual classes that have gone out here lately, where you've got, Zuckerberg or the founders who own 100% of the company before it goes public and still own 90% afterwards. When we were private, we were owned by the descendants of Levi Strauss himself. 98% of our shareholders before we went public were descendants of Levi Strauss himself, the family. And so it was very important to the family that they maintain control of the company. And so that's why we went dual class. And it's not the kind of family where you could have dinner around one of these small tables. You would probably need a room bigger than all of this for the family because we're in the 5th and 6th generation. So it's spread across a lot of people. And the ESG funds actually understood that. It is a different dual class structure than a lot of the tech companies that have gone.
Right.
And they kind of bought into that proposition. So we do have a number of funds that have bought into our stock, which is great because they tend to be real long-term shareholders who really believe, as do ESG investors, that companies that do the right thing are going to be companies that are going to be successful for the long term.
There's a very interesting question here about whether actually family-owned companies and private companies are able to be more ESG compliant than public companies. And that hasn't been debated at all as far as I can see. It is something we're going to be doing a special issue on quite soon in Moral Money, because there's an interesting question about how we imagine companies and how you determine purpose.
But I do believe that, and I'm kind of determined to prove it too, that public companies can run their business for the long term and can run their business by being focused on being values-led and not being afraid to stand up for the right things.
Well, let's hope you're right. But on that note, I'm going to ask for some questions. We have a question in the middle here. Now, we're pretty short of time, so please be brief and directed, no long statements. And it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Doran Pinnell. I came to Duke 49 years ago and never left. I did get the vote out in Durham, but that didn't help with the rest of the country. Speaking of voting, I know that neither Muslims nor Seventh-day Adventists vote. As corporate trailblazers, how can you help change that in the next election?
That is one they did not prep.
That's a great question, and I just learned something new. I did not know that. So I think it probably starts with education and engagement. And we have a number of employees that fall into that group, and I'm going to go back and begin engaging them right away and get their thoughts on how can we go after that. If they're citizens of this country, they're also citizens of this country. And as citizens of the country, they have an opportunity to make a difference by participating in the democratic process. So I was unaware, and thank you for raising that. And I'm going to take action on that right now. And I'm looking at Amber, my comms person, who's already taking notes.
Okay, you have your homework straight away. We've got a question over here. Okay, question in the back and then forward.
Hi, my name is Erin from Aspen Skiing Company. I'm curious, you talked about the positive side of building with purpose, and I'm curious for those of us in the room who are trying to lead with purpose at our companies, what have been some of the mistakes you've made along the way? What would you advise us to avoid as we try to follow your example?
Okay, Dan, I'm going to suggest you answer that one.
Okay. Just hoping that Chip was going to take that one as well.
I'm going to take it in turns.
I would think, look, I don't think there's a mistake you can make in being values-led. I honestly believe that, to Chip's point before, that is the right side of the way that the world is going right now. And even if it isn't, we have the responsibility, and you have the responsibility, to create values-driven companies that don't just have as their sole purpose maximizing profit. Right? We need to think about other constituencies. You need to think about your employees, which to me is the #1 constituency of a company. You have great employees, everything else will flow from there, who are passionate, who care about the mission. They will walk through walls to go do the right thing for customers. And if you do the right thing for customers, it always accrues back to both, in our case, regulators as well as shareholders. I think the really important thing, though, and Jillian, you talked about this, is syndicating what those values are amongst your leadership team and amongst your employees so that people understand why and how it's tied to your mission. As I've gotten older, I used to be a very operationally oriented individual. My team will still say, I love metrics. I love the nuts and bolts of a company. But the way you need to lead, and the way you need to inspire is through values and through mission. And always have that as the touchstone that you go back to, but make sure it's syndicated.
I think we've got a question right in the front and then over there. I'm trying to get both sides of the room, the right and the left. So, yeah.
Hello, my name is Jack Hayflick. I'm from New York. Longtime Levi admirer, but I can't wear your clothes anymore. They don't fit.
I could square you away on that.
Yeah, that's a market that you're missing.
Do you use PayPal?
What size are you?
Now, I have a question for Dan. You said that you pulled out of North Carolina because of the legislation that was passed there. Did you have presence, physical presence in the state? And how does a company such as yours pull out of a region, basically a geographic area?
Yeah.
Great question. And then we got a question.
So it was it was a little awkward because we had been with the governor 2 or 3 weeks before. We had spent a year searching for a location around the country to open up a 400, 600 person center that would do some of our back office compliance work. Great jobs. And we really needed it. And so we were on the governor. The governor gave us the bowl of North Carolina or whatever, which we seem to have lost because he demanded it back after we withdrew. And we finally found it, by the way, and happily gave it back.
What was it made of?
What?
What was it made of?
Wood.
Oh.
Yeah, wood. So we had not yet opened that office, but we needed to, and we were well underway in setting up our operations there. But I felt like we couldn't set up this operation with 400, 600 people in a state that had just come out with things that were anathema to our values.
We have 3 questions back there. Why don't we take all 3 of them as a group, because we are getting low on time.
Ariadne Platero, thank you. I'm very impressed by your various sort of mission-driven actions. But I'm wondering about the companies that are not brand leaders and are not very well-known names in their field. How do they, when their success is based on much more on dollars and cents than on being known, how do we encourage them to take mission-driven stance, and doesn't that need to be through legislation?
Great question. Let's take a couple more. We can maybe group them, because I imagine some of them may actually echo.
Yes, thank you. This is for Dan. It's a little bit out of the general subject, but you mentioned before that you have lots of regulation on your company. And now we hear that Facebook and others want to introduce Libra. What is your reaction to that? Are they going to be subject to regulations? Will it have an impact on the market generally, and therefore also on the social environment? Thank you.
And I think there was that it? Okay, those are two big questions. So why don't you take Libra? And why don't you take the question of what would you recommend a company should do if you don't have a situation where everyone's wearing you?
Okay, you want to go first? Libra.
Sure.
Subtext Libra.
Yeah. I don't know if everyone knows Libra, but Libra is a initiative that was introduced by Facebook that is looking at introducing kind of a new currency based on blockchain technology. We've worked closely with Facebook on Libra. We're a member of the Libra Association. And the reason we've worked so closely is that, Libra potentially ties in as a potential way of driving more financial inclusion. And there are 1.7 billion people in the world that are outside the financial system. They don't necessarily have credit cards. They don't have debit cards. And it's hard to be a part of the digital economy if you don't have those capabilities. And so the ability to put cash in and to be able to use that in a way that allows you to do purchases, to send money back and forth in maybe a more seamless way, maybe a less expensive way, is something that really appeals to our purpose, our mission, and our sense of values. Clearly, Libra is going to be regulated, and we feel like really in the game of financial services, the foundational level is that you have both regulatory requirements, that you comply with Know Your Customer, anti-money laundering, FinCEN obligations around anti-terrorism financing. And so this has to be kind of a foundational element of Libra, and I believe that it will be.
Right. You have about 30 seconds to tell us what you would advise unfamous companies to do.
First of all, I don't think you can legislate being values-led. I think if the companies have to believe that being purpose-driven and having a mission as a company that really does link back to some values, they have to believe in that. And when we ran our Vote campaign, as I said, we had over 400 companies join us. If you read through the list of companies that join us, there are a lot that you will recognize, but there will be companies that you don't recognize. And the fact of the matter is they still had employees and they have stakeholder groups as well. They gave their employees the same half day or longer off that day on election day to give them time to go vote. And every single company that joined us in that campaign made a difference. It was the first midterm where it was the highest voter turnout from an election standpoint in a midterm going back to the 1960s.
Right.
So I'd like to believe that we made a little bit of a difference.
Just one quick thing. I'm sorry, Julian. 60% of customers vote with their values. Like they buy based on their values. This is the right thing to go do. Just like equal pay is the right thing to go do. There should be no question about that. That people should be values oriented, drive with their values, let people know about it, because people actually buy with it. And that's why I think this whole idea about if you're private or public, leading with values is always the right thing to go do. Always.
Well, that's a good note to point out. I just have 2 or 3 quick things to say. Firstly, you have said it very well, Dan and Chip. Thank you. There is really quite a striking change underway right now. I mean, if you stop for a moment to think about the kind of conversations in Aspen 10, 15 years ago, you know, there's really quite a slow-moving but startling change underway. But people are still very much groping towards how they actually put this into practice. You know, I mean, we at the FT are groping around this. Any of you got any ideas about what we should or should not be covering at Moral Money, do let me know, because I want to learn. It is not clear-cut right now. But I would, last of all, just like to salute you both for having the courage to stick your necks out. It is not easy. Let nobody in the room take lightly what they said about death threats. You know, this involves not just financial risk, it also involves personal risk in many ways right now. But certainly what you've said is inspiring, and I do hope a lot more optimistic than the Republican Party debate. So thank you.